Service to bring factual and reliable science news to a general audience. Science Service would go on to publish popular magazines, including Science News Explores, books, host radio shows, distribute science kits, and establish leading student science competitions, plus much more. It's now called the Society for Science. I'm Elizabeth Quill, and I'm delighted to be part of the conversation tonight because I'm following in the path of many of these women science journalists who had a passion for both science and the craft of writing. Not only because I chose science journalism as my career, but because, as Marianne said, I'm also executive editor at Science News, a magazine that has been in continuous publication since it was first launched by Science Service more than a century ago. But the stars tonight are really the characters in this book. So Marcel, do you want to start by telling us about these pioneering journalists?
Yes, thank you, Beth, and thanks everybody for braving the heat. And just remember the women that I'm talking about tonight lived and worked in DC before air conditioning. So this is a little bit of a reminder of what they went through. I want to begin with sort of describing three of the women in the book who exemplify the themes of the book. Helen Augusta Miles was born in DC. She took a degree in chemistry at GW. Am I moving around too much? That's okay. Let's get this over a little bit. Is that better? Okay. So she took a degree in chemistry at GW, and that's where she met her future husband, Watson Davis. Watson was born and raised in the 900 block of 11th Street Southeast, so where his parents and several of his siblings lived. So that meant that Helen was, after she married Watson, on the Hill a lot to visit her relatives. And we know from their home movies that this was a vibrant time of family celebrations as well. Her letters exude energy. One of my favorite is one that was written in 1925 to her husband, Watson. Watson was down in Tennessee covering the Scopes trial. And in one paragraph, one single paragraph, she mentions running their concrete testing business, changing a flat tire, going with her mother-in-law to National Theater, and dealing with her one-year-old daughter who was teething at the time. So she had a lot of energy for a lot of activities. She did most of her writing at home at that point while she's raising a family, but by the 30s and 40s she was more involved in the news service and eventually wrote several books and was editor of Chemistry magazine. Now there are plentiful archival traces of Helen because her family has very generously donated papers, and her granddaughter has transcribed a lot of her notes and correspondence. So we have a lot of material about Helen's personal life. Emma Ray, another person who's described in the book, was born in Czechoslovakia and came to the United States in 1905 at age 9 with the rest of her family. They lived in Congress Heights. Her father worked at the Navy Yard, and she went to local high schools. She contributed to the Washington Post Cousins Club, Kids Post, where she wrote lots of fascinating essays about what it was like to be a young writer and what it was like to assimilate into a new country. She also went to GW, took a degree in chemistry, took her sorority sisters on moonlit hikes and played basketball. She went to work briefly as a chemist in a government lab, but then started to work for Science Service. She got married, and the marriage didn't last for really more than a year, and so when she and her husband Tom decided to separate and divorce, she decided she didn't have enough money for a divorce in Las Vegas or Paris, so she and another woman, Lenny Rader, got in a Ford and drove all the way to Texas, and then took a train to Mexico, where they rented a place in Mexico City, and Emma started to make money by writing about the archaeological digs and other science in Mexico. Well, Tom, her estranged husband, hemmed and hawed and didn't always send the money, so she wound up staying there a lot longer than she intended. But she fell in love with the country, fell in love with archaeology, fell in love with the whole idea of being a science journalist abroad. sold news stories to Science Service, to the New York Times, and essentially became a very well-known and very well-regarded science journalist. But Emma never married. She had no children. She outlived all of her siblings. So the only correspondence we have from her is the correspondence that's at the Smithsonian, where fortunately when she was writing back to her former colleagues, she would add in these little personal notes. But there's very little for her for the last few years of her life. So another woman who was hired in the 20s was Emily Cleveland Davis. Emily was born in Georgia to socially connected but economically strapped family. After her father died in 1902, she and her mother moved to D.C., where her mother taught in public schools, and Emily attended high school, went to American University. They were much more social butterflies, and so she was very well connected here in D.C. And participated in suffrage events. She also was in an all-female production of Love's Labor's Lost at the Belmont House. And every summer, she and her mother got in their car and drove around the country. They drove to Canada by themselves. They drove to World's Fairs. They drove to California. Generally, Emily had a very successful career as a science journalist up until World War II, when she went to work for the government. Emily never married, never had any children, and she outlived almost every relative. So all of the personal traces I have for Emily are the ones that are left in the Smithsonian records, and there's nothing that I've been able to find for the last 40 years of her life. And I'd really give a lot to see those travel diaries from when they were driving all over the country. There are similar trajectories, similar stories for a lot of the other women in the book: Marjorie McNeil Bright, Jane Stafford, Marjorie Vandewater, Anne Ewing, Martha Murrow. They were all well educated. They all came from sort of reasonably well-off backgrounds, most of them. There are often family upheavals and tragedies in their backgrounds, but the one thing they all shared in common was a love of science, a love of writing, and they just never gave up. And many of them would just wear a hat or beads while they're sitting at the typewriter and would happily go into all the press conference to cover science.
So these women really wanted to write about science at a time when journalism and science were dominated by men. And
Right.
Women had just only recently gotten the right to vote in this country. Can you set the scene for us? What was the cultural context?
Well, 1920s are a challenging time for women in this country. Women had achieved the right to vote, but that didn't give you the right to a job, didn't give you the right to access. In both science and journalism, men were the leaders in the scientific associations. They were the ones who were on the committees. They were the officers in the associations. And if you were consuming popular culture, the stereotypes in popular culture were that men were the norm in science. The ordinary science was a man. So if you were a woman and you wanted to study science, you wanted to be a scientist, you wanted to write about science, you were an anomaly. Even Marie Curie, a female professor in a women's college, a female worker in a government lab, was still considered to be an anomaly, not really quite the norm in science in those days. So, they were always, as pioneers, conspicuous in their gender. Now, I know what it's like to be the only woman in a physics class where I've been conspicuous in my gender. And I'm a naturally shy person, so, I go into the class, or later when I briefly was an assistant editor at Engineering Magazine, I'd go into cover professional associations, and I too would want to kind of shrink into the corner. But you've got a job to do. So like these women, you just take a deep breath, and you're conspicuous in whatever it is you feel conspicuous in about, and you just do your work, do your job, and go forward. And one of the messages of the book is that sort of lesson of persistence, to just keep at it, no matter what.
How did they all end up working for the same organization, Science Service?
Well, that is a matter of charitable generosity, open-mindedness or an open door policy, and a lot of serendipity. This is a time in which you have a lot of people and a lot of men in the scientific establishment, the leaders of science, who tend to think that popularization is sensationalism, that anytime you're communicating about science, then that's sensationalizing science, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But fortunately, there was a multimillionaire newspaper publisher, E.W. Scripps, who had also a close friend, William Ritter, who was a biologist, and the two of them came up with an idea for what became Science Service. Scripps provided the first endowment for the organization. And it was established in 1921 with this mission of communicating about science to the public. That's the generosity part of it. What happened was next, when they were deciding who was going to be the director of this fledgling organization, they could have chosen all sorts of different people, but they wound up choosing Edwin Slosson. And quite serendipitously, he was someone who believed passionately in equal rights for women. He was married to a prominent suffragist. He had participated in suffrage rallies, and now he had an opportunity to kind of put all of that into play. But of course, he was also a pragmatist. He had a job to do. He needed to make this a success. So he networked, he wrote letters to everybody he knew. He opened the door, but he opened the door to anybody who could write about science and write and be interested in science and write well. So he gave opportunities to former colleagues like psychologist June Downey. There was an astronomer in the Washington area, Isabel Lewis. He convinced her to write a column for Science Service. So opening that door gave opportunity to women that they didn't have otherwise. And so he really hired an unusual number of women for the permanent staff in the 20s, and many of them stayed. People like Emily Davis, Jane Stafford, and Marjorie Vandewater stayed for decades.
They were driven by this passion. What were some of the obstacles that they faced in their
some
work?
Well, some of those obstacles are ones that women still face today. Child care. Marjorie McDill Bright had taken her degree at William Smith, which is part of or connected to Hobart. She took graduate courses at Cornell, and then married. And she was living in Washington and starting to work for the Science Service as a full-time. But then she and her husband divorced, so she had a small child to raise. Again, the people at Science Service were very accommodating to changes in the lives of the women who worked on the staff, which was somewhat unusual for the time. So they changed her name on the masthead when she became divorced. But then when she remarried, she married a physicist, and this was the time when young physicists moving up in their career needed to move around the country. So she resigned her full-time job and became a stringer, one of the standard part-time writers for Science Service and other places. And she wrote about natural history for the rest of her life, moving as they moved in his career from time to time. And the other kinds of obstacles were the same obstacles that people face when they go into just about any place where they're not made to feel welcome. So Jane Stafford was often the only woman in a medical press conference, and the same for Marjorie Vandewater at psychology conferences.
One of the key challenges we face in journalism at Science News is really making the science accessible, making it appealing for the audience. These women were wonderfully skilled at that, obviously. How did they make the science accessible and interesting and get newspapers to want to buy it and readers to want to read it?
Right, and that notion of making sure that what you wrote about and the way you wrote about things that you were accurate in describing the science, but also making it interesting to the people, to your readers. That was an important part, that you weren't spoon-feeding your readers what the scientists wanted the readers to hear or wanted the public to hear, but what might be useful for your readers. And hence, in a way, the title of the book, Writing for Their Lives. I really felt that, especially for the writers who were writing about psychology and medicine, they were writing for the lives of their readers. But science and engineering are highly technical fields with a lot of technical terminology. So translating that was always a challenge, especially challenging for Jane Stafford when she's writing about medicine. And she was facing some of the same cultural challenges the newspapers are facing today about how you phrase things. In the 1920s, newspapers regarded the word syphilis as taboo, but Science Service, in its print versions, used that word from 1923 on. Jane Stafford, who's a very seemingly prim and proper person, wrote about all sorts of sexually transmitted diseases. She used the words about prophylactics, venereal disease. She used those in her writing. And then in the mid-1930s, when there was a real push by the Public Health Service to try to educate especially men about sexually transmitted disease, she became involved in that campaign and wrote columns and news series that went out to more than 3 million readers around the country, and participated in developing posters to help communicate about this issue. And yet, she knew that she had readers in some parts of the country who might not appreciate some of the open language. And so there is some correspondence where she's back and forth with her editor about, or the director of the Science Service, about whether she should talk about birth control in her health column, because that might turn off the newspapers in the South. So it's always a matter of language and adjusting to the audience.
And what happened? That is, did she write about it or did she not write about it?
I think she hesitated to write about that one in her column. It wasn't that they didn't cover birth control at all.
And they had to be careful not to alienate the scientists. I mean, our first responsibility is to the audience, but we also depend on our network of science sources to kind of let us know what's happening, clarify things. We depend on embargoed access to papers and journals, and are often constrained by the journal publishing schedule. So what did these scientists face, or these journalists face, in terms of censorship and access to information?
Well, the same kind of things you do today. I mean, there's always this sense that when it's an understandable one, that the research you're presenting is yours, and you should be able to control how it's presented out to the world. But journalists invited into a press conference or to an open scientific conference would feel that they would be free to write about what they heard in the press conference or at the scientific meeting. Occasionally you would have scientists object to that. You also, especially in the 1930s, had more efforts by the associations to impose forms of, let's say, embargoes and advanced censorship on what's being reported. At the American Psychological Association meetings, B.F. Skinner and his committee would meet with the journalists who had come to cover the APA meetings and go over the abstracts that were being released to the journalists and also criticize their past coverage of the APA meetings. No pressure here, of course. Jane Stafford would often get a lot of blowback on her coverage of things. What happened then when the United States went into World War II, government censorship is imposed. And that poses a completely different issue for journalists, most of whom are willing to cooperate with the government censorship, military censorship, and many of whom know a lot more about the fields than the censors themselves. But we tend to think of this as applying primarily to physics and to what we now know was the Manhattan Project. There was also a lot of censorship applied to medicine, and Jane Stafford was really having to navigate that particular problem because she saw the information coming out of the medical research establishment as important to the health of her readers. So she's constantly going up against the efforts to censor things. They would receive the American Medical Association journals in advance of publication so that they could go through the journals, but those journals were, at that point in World War II, being delayed by the censors, so that was also putting Science Services work at a disadvantage in the competition with the newspapers. So she's always having to adjust all of that. I found one episode where she's going through, she's being told she can't talk at all about this particular research project because the Army has said, don't say anything about this. And it's about a possible substitute for quinine, which was in short supply because of the war, and there are scientists looking for a substitute. So there's some wonderful notes in the archives. So you can see Jane with a phone in her hand, scribbling notes, calling up all of her sources, and saying, how far can I go with this? And when am I going to be able to report about this particular research? So that's the kind of thing they're constantly hitting up against.
Well, you brought up the Manhattan Project, so let's talk about the atom bomb and the coverage of that. A lot of what we cover in science news wouldn't necessarily be considered breaking news for a general audience. You know, some of the highlights of my career is coverage of the Higgs boson discovery in 2012, or in 2020 the first picture of a black hole. But I would kind of draw parallels between the coverage described in the book and our coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. And in the early days of that, how it was just sort of all hands on deck figuring out what this new virus was, what the science behind it was, what was going to happen next. So can you talk about the dropping of the atom bomb and how this team took on that news?
Yeah, okay. And this was the biggest story of their lives. So on the morning of Monday morning, August 6th, at 11:06, so August 6, 1945, at 11:06 a.m., the news went out over the wires that a bomb had been dropped on Japan. Now, most people who heard that news thought, this will mean, we hope, the end of the war and end of the military action in the Pacific. To science journalists, this meant, this is also an enormous science story because this is an incredible achievement. The Manhattan Project wouldn't have been news to them. They would have known or heard that something was going on behind the scenes. But now there's this enormous science story, and they've got to figure out how to cover it for the clients to whom they were selling news stories. Watson Davis, who was the director of Science Service, was abroad on government business, so there were only 5 writers left in the office at that point. And they decided to sort of divide up the aspects of the story and each cover different aspects. Helen Davis explored the chemistry of explosions, Jane Stafford looked at radiation and physiology and how medicine might be influenced by this new kind of power. The physics writer Martha Murrow looked at the physics. Frank Thone, who was one of the staffers, worked on the biological impacts on the environment. And Marjorie Vandewater did what she did the best. She concentrated on the psychological and social implications of this terrible new weapon. Between August 6th and August 9th, all they knew at that point was that 2 bombs then had been used and civilians had been killed. But then on Friday, August the 10th, the official technical report, which we call now the Smythe Report because it was written by Henry Smythe, was released to the press. The description of that Friday is really one of the more intense and exciting things, I think, in the archival resources. That Friday, only 3 of the writers were left in the office: Helen Davis, Jane Stafford, and Marjorie Vandewater. And Helen wrote later to her daughter Charlotte, the same one who was teething back in 1925, "When we 3 get together and pool our talents, you'd be surprised what a good physicist we make." Now that document was multilith, that's how they distributed then, and over an inch thick. So what they did was to get 2 copies. They kept one of them intact, she told Charlotte, and we pulled the staples out of the other one so we could just work on all parts of it at once. Those weeks were incredibly frantic, incredibly intense. All the writers talked about how the phone was ringing off the hook constantly. It was 80 degrees or higher in Washington and no air conditioning, so you can imagine what it was like in the office. But to read the internal memos from that time, you have this incredible sense of their own accomplishment. They collaborated, they cooperated, they got the work done and got the story written. But again, as Marjorie Vandewater recalled later, and this is characteristic of, again, how she would see a science story but see it from another way. It was not possible to think of anything else except one stupendous fact: atomic fission, atomic power, atomic destruction, unlimited except by the unpredictable desires of the human heart. Now, I can describe that incredible week in the news office and everything that was going on, in part because of the generosity of Helen Davis's family, which has preserved a lot of the records of Helen and Watson. And her granddaughters transcribed that correspondence and shared it with me. Every time I read those letters, the intimacy and the detail of those letters just are reminders of the archival traces that are lost for many of these women who didn't have children, or survived everybody else in the families, and no one saved their records, because we are more than the words we leave behind. I want to know more about the emotional lives of these women. Every time I found a postscript or a marginal note, it was a reminder to me of things that could be lost. So I have a mission today for all of you in the future to join me and others in helping to preserve the records of women and other people who are not the big names and who are not the ones for whom the papers are most ordinarily collected, so we can know more about not just what they did, but who they were. That's an important way for historians like me to write books like this going forward.
In reading the text, and especially the passages from that August, I was struck by how little has changed in the spirit of the job, but of course a lot has changed in the technology and how the job gets done, both in terms of how journalists get information, but also where and how they reach their audiences. What do you think have been some of the most dramatic or important changes since then.
Well, I think the technology is one of the things. I mean, that's really, I mean, they were typewriters. They were typewriter people. And you can tell in the archives the point at which they start using the telephone more often, because there's not enough of that the long letters with carbons, which were preserved in the archives. But at some point they're talking to people and interviewing people on the phone and scribbling out notes, which are not always all that legible. Science Service at that point experimented with all kinds of different technologies with radio. That's what I wrote about in the radio book. With microfilm. They saw microfilm as possibly the way of communicating in the future. They never really got around to trying television. So it's kind of interesting to speculate about what they would be doing today. So we were talking beforehand a little bit about what
Science News
doing
now. I mean, most of our audience is online. We reach 1.9 million unique visitors each month at our website, sciencenews.org, and we're have millions of followers on Twitter, now X, and nearly 2 million followers on Facebook. We're on TikTok, YouTube, so there's all new ways to reach our audience and all kind of different types of audiences to reach. So I think that's exciting. It makes it exciting in terms of how we can get science news directly to people with still some of the same challenges, but not the gatekeepers of the newspapers buying stories from us.
How do you hear from your readers?
Well, the feedback on TikTok and Facebook and Twitter is immediate, right? And that's the other different thing. It's not, when I first started at Science News, we got a lot of snail mail letters, and now it's much more comment sections and replies and stitches, which is a word I'm only recently familiar with. So it's an exciting time, but it offers a lot, I think, of opportunities in terms of what you write about and how you write about it, that I think some of these journalists would have been excited by.
And hopefully you take the feedback from the readers as seriously as they did in 1920 and 1930.
Definitely. We're pleasing our audience, right? That's our main job. Yeah. Do you want to open it up for questions?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is now a good time?
Yeah.
Let me pass the microphone around since we are filming it.
I see Wendy is anxious to ask another question.
Hi, Marcel. It's fascinating. Did these women have scoops? Were they on deadline? Is the writing that they did the first time it was written, or is it all secondary sources?
It's it's all. They did use secondary sources. They were skilled. They were constantly scanning the scientific literature, the journal literature of the time. But they're also doing original reporting. They're going to scientific meetings, to professional meetings in all these different fields of science. They're meeting with and getting to know particular sources. It's clear that some of them had good relations with sources who would provide them with here's so-and-so's going to be presenting a paper at the next meeting. You might want to talk to him or her, but usually it's to him. They have from the beginning. They had a number of different products. They were initially a magazine, which is really what Science News. We chose Science News. Yes. That's really exactly, except it's in color from what they were producing in the 1920s. A magazine that you could hold and read. But they were also producing copy eventually for wire service clients. So they had individual newspaper clients they were producing copy for. And when events happened, the Scopes trial was a classic one because that was a big event for all of science, especially for the biology community. And I've written about that in another book where the two of the Science Service journalists went down to Dayton and covered it live. They were actually embedded with the defense team, and I mean embedded in that they all stayed in the same place. And they were covering and interviewing and sending back bulletins from the trial. And occasionally when there was some sort of an event that was science related, they would be covering that and sending out news over the wires. Eclipses, excuse me, eclipses they would cover as a breaking news story, that kind of thing. So it's a combination of both. And then they would work on enterprise, what you would call an enterprise story. And then especially in the 1930s, they got Jane Stafford and Marjorie Van de Water and Emily Davis were very good at writing what were sort of these one-page, full-page, science page pieces that they sold to their client newspapers. And all three of those women were really good at finding a kind of a semi-sensational hook to drag you in to read about what was going to be a really quite solidly reported science story. That help? Anna? Oh, I'm sorry.
Just curious, you talked about the nature of the instance where several of the women, or a handful of them, in terms of the Manhattan Project or the outcome of that report, worked very closely together and decided how to proceed. My question is, given that example, do you have any indication that the nature of how women approached the job was different from their male colleagues?
Among the Smithsonian archivists, there was a point at which we were all very fond of Frank Thone because he was the biology editor, because he liked posing in silly poses for the photographer. But Thone was also known to have a terrible temper and to be very prickly about the territory of his material. I didn't find that kind of evidence for the other writers. And my sense, although no one, again, you're missing a lot of the diaries and the personal comments they might have made, I think there was much more sense of the women cooperating. That said, there are times when Jane Stafford was on the road. She had a story. There was one particular one that involved coverage of new flu research. She sent most of the story back to the office. Robert Potter was in the office. He's the physics editor at the time. And he then got on the phone and compiled a lot of data to put into the article, which ran with Jane's byline. So there was, I think with the exception of Thone, who could sometimes be a little difficult, they all really seemed to cooperate well and collaborate as a team, and especially for the coverage of, in August 1945. Now, I'm biased.
So I have a quick question. Today we're dealing with a lot of misinformation about science, pushback against science. Did these women face that, and was science facing that at that time?
Oh, definitely, most definitely.
And how did they overcome that? How did they prevail?
I mean, that's a difficult issue for them because they're covering the science of the day. And there are times when, do I need to move this over a little bit? Okay. There are times when they're covering someone who then, let's say a year or so later, everyone begins to perhaps question that person's research. So they're not in the business of being censors on the science of the day. They're trying to be honest in their own reporting. But they also are, and one of the things that I've always admired about the writers then is they really worked hard to be as accurate as they could at the time. And they gained the respect of their newspaper clients. And there's a lot of, there is correspondence from newspaper editors around the country saying how much we appreciate this. That they were pushing back against the kind of quack cures the people, especially in medicine, who were pushing things that people within the field knew weren't, was not the correct way or wasn't accurate, wasn't good scientific information. So yes, they're constantly doing that, trying to negotiate the politics of the day. Someday, if anybody wants a research project, there's some great things in the archives of letters and other documents submitted by people who have the cure of all cures, the explanation for all of physics, and all of those kinds of great crank letters. So if you're looking for an X project,
We still get those letters today.
there's one that in fact covers the entire table. Anna?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You talked a lot about writing for your audience, and I was wondering if we had an idea about how many women were reading science magazines at that time, and if that seemed to affect what they wrote about, thinking that their audience was mostly male.
Now, two parts. The second part, I don't think they discriminated in that respect. They were writing for their entire audience. And in fact, they were getting feedback from female readers. And one of the things that's really gratifying is to read the letters from the young women who are writing in and saying, I'd like to be like you. I'd like a job like yours. I'd like to be a science journalist, and do you have a job for me, or how do I get to be like you? And so there's no sense that they are necessarily writing for a gender-linked audience, but rather for a broader audience. They're also very conscious of the fact that, and this is still true today, I think, that the audience has a lot of children. There are a lot of children who are reading the magazine. There's some really touching letters from families who take the magazine and whose children read the magazine. And there's one that I've written about for what used to be the bigger picture, was the blog the Smithsonian Archives ran. There was one on a young woman who wrote about a porcupine, and so she's writing back and forth to Frank Thone, and clearly very engaged with science and with the publication.
And today we are in more than 5,000 high schools through the Science News Learning Program. And we also have, Science News Explorers, which is our magazine geared more toward middle school students. So we're very conscious of that audience as well, and how we meet the needs and being accessible with the language and topics for those student audiences.
Okay, now Anna.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. So you mentioned that they needed to add a certain sensationalist element in order to draw in their audiences and be able to sell their writing. And then also, like, if they're catering to a younger audience, they especially would need to translate things into more common language. You also mentioned that there was concern within the scientific community around sensationalizing science, and they would need to stay connected to that community to be able to continue to write. So how did they handle that trade-off?
It's a constant juggling of things. In a way, the director of Science Service was the shield against the criticism that would come through the trustees. And I meant to look up to see when the organization finally added a woman to the Board of Trustees, but it wasn't until the 60s, 70s. Sure, yeah. So for a very long time, the trustees were all men. Some of them for the newspaper, from the newspaper industry, but the scientists, and they would be really on the back of the director, saying, "Well, you're going a little too far here." The good thing was that when you can see that the director is constantly kind of protecting them, because the goal is to be accurate, but also to serve the audience and not try to spoon feed the audience something that only the scientists want them to hear. So, yes, that's a constant struggle, but they were really skilled at navigating that, and the more they succeeded at their task, which was to reach a broader audiences, the more newspaper clients they got, then the more feedback they got from the newspaper industry to say, hey, these people are doing a really great job in reaching the public. And then, of course, what happens is when you get to the 1930s, the scientific establishment itself is also trying to make its case to the public for public funding of science. And that especially happens after World War II. So then, of course, it's all about, and I'm somebody who's participated in all too many committees on public understanding of science and how can we get the public interested in science. So then it becomes really all about how do we reach the newspapers and how do we get the public involved. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both for coming out. I have a STEM background, so when I was doing my undergrad, there were plenty of programs to increase the amount of women in my undergraduate program and other engineering fields, but never did I hear about increasing representation of science writers. So I'm curious, when you were studying these women, was there any sort of correspondence or relationship between the women science writers and the sort of pioneering women scientists of the age? For example, like Grace Hopper, very early women computer programmer. Were those sort of movements intertwined at all?
Well, there is correspondence between these women and some of the and female scientists. Yes, they're cordial relationships in all the way through. I think what you're getting at is, was there an effort to think about recruiting people to become science journalists? Well, these people were really pioneering in the field in the beginning. Jane Stafford was present when other journalists who were working for newspapers and reporting on science decided they were going to create or found the Association for Science Writing. So you've got associations that are only being founded and created in the early 1930s, and that's by like 4 or 5 people. Watson Davis was really struggling when some of the trustees were asking him, well, how many are there around the country? And he was actually, there are a couple lists where he's having to list public relations people for the American Medical Association. That's not a journalist. And somebody else who was a popular science book author, but not a science journalist. But he was trying to prove that we're starting to be a critical mass of people. So these really are the pioneers. I mean, Emily Davis is the first one to really cover archaeology. And Marjorie Vandewater is one of the first to really cover sociology, psychology. She went to every psychology association meeting. So yeah, these are all those kinds of people. And when people are writing and asking, how do you become who you are, they would say, well, you can get a science degree and then get some writing experience.
And we today actually, I don't have the particular stats on it, but science writing, science journalism is often considered to be dominated by women. In some sense, our staff at Science News Today is about 33 people, and we only have 6 men on the staff. And it's my perception that some of that is because we attract women who leave the sciences, so who get a master's or a PhD in a science field, but might decide that the scientific environment isn't right for them, or it doesn't, draw on the skills that they're most interested in pursuing, and they want to communicate, so they end up going to science writing programs and becoming science writers.
But the other reason for writing this book was also to bring up the profile of these particular women, because when you look at Wikipedia or places like that, and lists of science journalists, and look back to who historically are the science journalists of the 20s and 30s. You see William Lawrence and Hillary Crickbaum and Waldemar Kempfart. You see all these guys. And the women, Jane Stafford and Marjorie Vandewater and all of those people who are actually doing, they're working every day at this. They've sort of fallen by the way. So they've been hidden figures for real in science journalism.
And you think that's in part because they didn't have the bylines? Or do you think it's more of a recasting of history?
I think it's also women are not really good at promoting themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they were, Watson Davis was constantly having to get Jane and Marjorie to give him give him a folder of their writings so he could submit it to a prize committee. And there are a couple of times, and Marjorie said, I don't want to do this, and Jane says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to, go up. But that, of course, is the way in which all of the male journalists were getting their newspapers to submit all of their body of work so that they could be up for the Pulitzer or something like that. So I think, lots of things going on that we don't really know for sure.
These women have chosen an abnormal career, and they are in a world where the expectations for women are very, very different. So they have this problem of how to pursue this passion of theirs, but they then cannot meet the expectations of the society to be a wife and a mother in the conventional way. And so it seems to me this must have been a central struggle for their lives. You say they're writing for their lives, and I can understand they've got this passion, they want to pursue it. But if they pursue it, then they must become abnormal women. And that must create a great pressure on them, a psychological pressure on them, because they're not like the other women. And I was wondering, do you see signs of this, I guess, stress in their lives?
I'm not sure I would agree with that.
Okay.
Helen Davis had 2 kids, raised 2 kids. Actually, Miles Davis is still alive and living in Texas, and Charlotte was her daughter was one of the founders of the computing industry. She was helping to build the internet in the early days, and so she had these 2 kids, a house, a business, and was a writer, published books. Was editor of Chemistry magazine. Margie McDill Bright also had a child. And so there are lots of writers, lots of these women who had conventional personal lives. Jane Stafford, what kind of romantic life she had? There are lots of comments about how attractive she was, and a little bit of maybe romantic flirting with her, and some of the maybe she just didn't find the right person, and what the other personal lives of Emily Davis and Marjorie Vandewater, I don't know, because I don't have their diaries and a lot of background for them. There is nothing that I found that said to me that they were not happy in their lives and fulfilled in their lives. I think one of the things that shines through for all of them is a sense of accomplishment, and they continued to do it for a very long time. There was years ago, I used to be on an orange hat patrol on the Hill, the days when we did orange hats. And I was just starting to do some research on Science Service, and I mentioned to one of the people on the patrol, and who was a woman who lived on the Hill, and Science Service, she said, "Oh, I worked there when I was young, and it was the best job I ever had, the best place I ever worked." So there was something about that particular environment that was open, collaborative, welcoming, and it didn't matter what your lifestyle was, what you know, whether you had other kids. They accommodated child care considerations, and they wanted to keep one of the artists who was really good. And so Watson Davis said, well, Davis said to her, Elizabeth Goodwin, hey, we'll just work it out. So you can do some of the drawings at home and take care of your little child. So they're very advanced for their time in making the accommodations that we all know have to be made if families have to be raised and children have to be raised and meals have to be cooked by somebody. But I really never saw that disappointment that, you might be.
Beth, do you have one final question?
No, I mean, I just want to thank Marcella Follett for putting together. I personally, it's so rewarding to read these stories of these women having gone through the archive and read the journalism that they produced, but not necessarily being able to tie it to them. It's wonderful. So thank you for illuminating their lives for us.
Good.
Their work.
Thank you for all for coming out on a hot night.
Thank you all for coming. Thank both of you. And Marcel will be signing books in the room just to the right.